Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I'm pleased to be able to take a short call on behalf of the Green Party in the committee stages of this bill. And I too want to add my voice to others in this debate in support, and also in particular acknowledgement of the members of the committee and the members of the House, particularly the chair of the committee, and possibly the Minister, who have had more recent experience of a civil defence emergency. And I've got to say that on the committee, the Chair's experience was incredibly informative, that she knew what questions to ask and what areas of tension have arisen in the past between local activity and the systems, the more formalised systems, and that going into looking at this bill, that was a particular area of concern for us, because from the previous speaker, Porter Williams, talking about the recovery activities in Aranui, and we heard some amazing stories in Littleton as well. More recently, and on a small-scale event, some of the recent flooding up in Kapiti, I know how the community there came together to be able to support people who were affected by the flood, who maybe didn't have, were suffering financially as a result of the impacts of the flood, and that people would take turns to go with somebody to work an income to manage the formalised systems. But it was actually the relationship and community that was essential to people's sense of well-being in that recovery process. So it's really critical that we get legislation that facilitates and aids that local connectedness and local response, but just monitors and fills in the gaps and does the more formal systems that if a community is unable to do them themselves. And I do feel, you know, this kind of legislation probably should always continue to be evaluated after events to make sure that we've got it right. And you can never, I don't think, stand up and say, yes, we've got it 100% right before you've had it in practice. But I am feeling that we made really good progress in the committee, and there was a lot of changes made through that process of questioning and testing it through discussion against the experience of some of the members and the submissions. And I am really pleased that the Labour member Claire Curran is adding the SOP to reinsert the strategic recovery plans into the legislation, and that the government indeed is supporting that. I think the rationale that from the government members on the committee, as well as I think some of the advice, was that we didn't need it because within the legislation there is a function of planning that is built into the legislation for civil defence and emergency groups and recovery managers. So there was no need, and it might create confusion by putting a plan into the legislation as well. And so rather, when submitters had raised concerns about the lack of clarity or specificity, the thought was like, oh, well, we'll take it out so we don't get confusion. But I think it's much better to put it in and to get the support of the government with the guidance to provide the specificity, because we have heard stories from different places around the country of very different levels of knowledge and experience around planning. So actually to put it in the legislation, to put the guidance behind it with the codes, technical standards, guidance for timing and longevity as examples, I think will help the local on-the-ground organisers work through those steps of recovery that we want them to work through. So the Green Party will be very happy to support that SOP. And I would also just really briefly like to touch on, which was raised earlier by Honourable Ruth Dyson, the initial concern we had around the permanent legislative authority. I'll speak for the Greens as we interrogated that, and the officials gave us some very clear advice, and I have absolute confidence in the validity of that as a tool for giving council surety for funding.